Grady very much. You know, we all have these fond memories of days gone by that in our just daydreaming moments, fond memories. You look back and you think, that was interesting. And I have a few of those memories that include Grady Holly as a junior high kid. But we'll save those for another conversation down the road a little bit. I am glad to be here and glad that this has finally come about. It's been something that a group of us, different ones, have been talking about for quite some time. And it has to do with the idea of how do we kind of get into the conversation that's going on in our world today around sustainable solutions. And so the idea of SAT Talks has grown out of that. SAT Talks stands for Sustainability and Transformation. It's got a combination of words that make sense in the church world. On the one hand, the church likes to talk about things like transformation. Your pastor will stand in front of you and give sermons on a regular basis about the ways in which a relationship with Christ can transform people, the way in which living by these kinds of biblical principles can transform a neighborhood, can transform a community, can transform all kinds. The church is familiar with the concept of transformation. But the word sustainability, now that's a different word. That's not a word that most of us grew up with going to church, hearing about sustainability. We'd hear lots about transformation and about what that would look like. But in recent years, the idea of sustainability continues to be part of an integral part of our conversations about what it means to do missions and to be missional in our world. One word is a part of our vocabulary, one is not. And why is that? Well, I think there's a couple of things that are happening in our world today that has caused the idea of transformation to need something in addition to it. One of them is a sociological situation. Another one, as I would suggest, is a theological, at least for the church. And sociologically, the world as a whole has gotten tired of the whole aid approach to solving problems. It's this idea that somehow, some way we can throw more money at something and in so doing, change things from what they are, help people out of poverty. And so you hear it in all kinds of conversations about breaking the cycle of poverty, about creating dependence because of the kinds of things that we do. How do we get out of that cycle? And we've had well-intended but misguided approaches to poverty in this country. We've had well-intended but misguided approaches to poverty in Africa and around the world. And the collective understanding of the world today, both in the church as well as in the philanthropic community as a whole, is that this idea of simply giving people money, giving people things, will help them break the cycle of poverty. And I would imagine that many of us today are here because intuitively we know that's not right. We've seen the effects of that kind of ongoing aid, that kind of ongoing giving, and it comes from a wonderful heart that wants to give back to a world in need, but it's as if the more we give, the more is expected out of that whole arrangement. And so you could almost predict that we would be where we are in the world today, having tried that for as long as we've tried it, and we're stepping back and saying there's got to be a different way. And so what does it look like for us to do good, not just in the philanthropic world, but also in the church mission world? What does it look like for us to do good in ways that lead to sustainable solutions? So sociologically, we're there. We know that we can't keep doing these kinds of things and have any kind of long-term lasting effect. But I think there's another thing that's playing in the church today, and that is that we're beginning to see some of the passages from Scripture in a little different way. And if we reflect on them enough, and we bring them in the context of where life is today, they suggest to us that there's got to be a better way. One of the passages that kind of steps out or sticks out in my mind is in that passage with Peter in chapter 3 of Acts, in which him and John are walking by the lame beggar, and the lame beggar is asking for some things. He says, "Can you help us?" And everybody knows what the routine is. You pass this guy, you see he has a need, you take some money out of your pocket, you give it to that guy, and that's the way that it worked in that day and time. And Peter says these words. Most of us have heard them at one time or another. Peter looks at him and he says, silver and gold have I none. But what I do, I give to you. Take up your mat and walk. And I think the church has made a mistake as it's looked at that passage over the years. And that we are trying somehow to replicate the miraculous works of Jesus. We're trying to figure out how we get that kind of power to somehow be able to look at somebody on a street corner and say, silver and gold have I none, but what I do have, I give to you. Take up your mat, walk. The reason I think we're mistaken there is because we cannot say what Peter said. It's no longer true that you and I can say, silver and gold have I none, but what I do have I'll give to you. Because guess what, folks? We do have silver and gold. That passage is not the same to us today because the circumstances are not the same. As a matter of fact, if you were to look at the reality of the evangelical church today, Christians, in our country today, 138 million Christians who attend church regularly and say that they're very serious about their faith. 138 million of us in that category. Collectively, if you look at that group earns $2.5 trillion a year. That would make us, just that subgroup, that would make us the 7th richest country in the world. We'd have a seat at the G8. So it's no longer true. We can't say, silver and gold have I none, but what I do have, because we do have silver and gold. And so the question is, what are we going to do with that? We have wealth and influence in ways that Peter and John and the early church could never have dreamt of. The question is not whether we can perform miracles or whether we have the faith to perform miracles like the early disciples, but whether or not we will use the resources he's given us and we'll bring those resources to bear upon the needs of others in ways that will glorify God and do good for others. So let me talk for just a minute about the idea of sustainability and what we're talking about here at SAT Talks. See, the idea behind this, and even the idea behind why we're going to take some of the questions on Twitter, is I simply want to get the church at the table. I want the church to be a part of the conversation, because guess what, folks? Nobody has it figured out. Bill Gates doesn't have it figured out, and he will admit it. The church doesn't have it figured out. Nobody has it figured out about how to do good in sustainable ways. But we're leaning into it. We're leaning into it and saying somehow, some way, we've got to figure these things out. And so it's about a conversation. It's about us coming together in places like this and being able to admit that we don't have it all figured out. It's about us becoming a collective peer-to-peer learning community. It's about us being willing to admit that we don't have some things figured out. It's about us paying the dumb tax, if you will. It's about us finding people within our communities who are willing to pay on the front end for some of the R&D that's necessary without requiring there to be results just like that every time we try something. Because guess what? Things that we try are going to fail along the way. We're going to find that it's 10 times, 100 times, maybe even more than that, easier to just keep doing relief and betterment than it is to do true development. And those of you from the business community, if you'll just put on your business hats for a second and think this through, you know why that's true. It's because any business that any business person has ever started was incredibly difficult, and their chances for success are very slim. So if we think that we can move into the world of need and poverty that lives out of a cash flow mentality, and that somehow we can apply simplistic solutions that will help them break the cycle of poverty just like that, then business folks, you're naive. It can't be done. And the folks out there on the fields giving their lives to this day in and day out need the freedom, need the ability to be able to explore and pursue certain things, try certain theories of change, and not be pressed to have to come back to you every time the funding comes with these results. Because guess what will happen? They'll come back to you with those results, and you'll end up paying for results when what we should be paying for are solutions. And solutions take time to figure out. And if anybody had them figured out, we would all replicate them. I want the church to be a part of that conversation, to be able to be at the table with all, both inside the church and outside the church, that are trying to tackle these issues. But let me define for you what I mean by sustainability. I was at a conference not too long ago, and at that conference was using the phrase sustainability, in which an economics professor from a Christian university down back in Ohio said to me, you know, when you use the word sustainability, it just shuts me down. And I realized that when he hears the word sustainability, he goes to the idea of environmental stewardship of the planet and those kinds of things. Now, I believe that's important. I believe that's incredibly important, but that's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about sustainability. I don't mean to understate that. I don't mean to, that's just not where my passion is at. Then I hear another word, another group within the church talk about sustainability being the answer to cash flow for not-for-profits and for donor fatigue of givers. Here's what I mean by that. There's a large conversation going on right now about business people wanting to start for-profit businesses that will channel the proceeds from that for-profit to keep the doors open for this not-for-profit. Again, I think that's a creative idea. I think lots of business people can do those kinds of things. But I just want you to know that's not what I mean by sustainability here. That's a way for us to sustain a not-for-profit by taking a for-profit business and putting it to a not-for-profit business. And that phrase gets used in that context too. I'm talking about a very specific type of sustainability, and the speakers that you're going to hear this morning are talking about a very specific type of sustainability, which gets to what we're trying to get at here at the SAT Talks. Part of what has to happen in this movement is we have to begin using the same word in the same way. It doesn't mean that there aren't other ways to use it and that there may not be other more important things. It's that that's not what this is about. This is about a different kind of sustainability. The sustainability we're talking about here is transformative solutions that are self-sustaining by the recipients. Sustainable solutions that are self-sustaining by the recipients. And so it's outside of us. It's outside of the agencies that are trying to deliver the services in the context of poverty. How do we create solutions so that people within communities can sustain themselves and they no longer need you and I and our charitable resources to keep that going? Because most of us in this room already live in communities like that. Our communities do not need people from the outside to bring charitable resources into our community so that our children can get a good education, so that our children can get into a college, so that our children can be safe. We don't need that. We live in communities where that's already happening. And if we have to continue to go into communities and pour resources into that community just to give a young person a chance to succeed at life, that's not sustainable. Even if you're sustaining the not-for-profits with businesses alongside of them that are delivering those services. And I like to use the phrase that Bob Lupton uses, and he simply says to the church, you cannot serve people out of poverty. And our narrative, our story, the Christian message is about serving people. So I believe that to be very true and very important in the things that we have to do. But the message is not about continuing to simply serve when we can create solutions that, in context, will help people sustain themselves. That's what we're talking about here. And so, real quickly, I want to leave you with some thoughts about what I think has happened and what's going on in our world today. And part of that comes out of my own story. I pastored for 32 years. And one of the things that began to happen to me in that work of pastoring, and as I was doing mission work and going to places like Venezuela and the Philippines and all of those sort of things, trained in Bible and theology with a master's degree then at Wheaton College, and so the pedigree is there. I've been to those places. I love my background and my training, but something began to happen, and I think it's happening in a lot of pastors, that as we continue to be in those places and see the folks that we're working with, I'm not trained as a business person. I'm not trained in the kinds of things that you business folks deal with as second nature. But as I kept doing things in Venezuela and in places like that, something didn't fit. And it began to dawn on me, I can't believe this will never end. And it started me down this journey of thinking, what do these people need beyond the message and the hope that I deeply believe is true and that I deeply want to bring to people about the difference that Christ can make in one's life. But they needed something in addition to that, and I was not prepared, or I didn't have the wherewithal. And I began to connect them, and it seems awfully simplistic right now, but I began to connect that everything I was doing in a missional world was in the context of poverty. The common denominator was poverty. We weren't sending missionaries down to Leawood. We were going to places where there was concentrated poverty. And I'm thinking, what is it in poverty that we're dealing with here? Well, part of it has to do with the ability and the dignity that comes with being able to provide for yourself. So it has something to do with both opportunity and financial possibilities and that kind of stuff. And I started connecting the dots in my head, and it began to dawn on me that if the church was going to move out of just this service mentality, it was going to have to start leaning into things like business. How do you help somebody that you're trying to work with in the Philippines or in South Africa? How do you help that person begin to figure out how to earn a living? And I realized I'm not trained to do that, which then began to push me in my own mind that if the church is going to provide an answer to poverty that has something to do with economics, it's going to require the business people from our church to step up. And I began to look around and I realized that more and more of the business people within my church had no place to bring their A game. They would come to the church on Sundays and they would participate in maybe teaching a Sunday school class or the bean supper or parking cars, singing in the choir, all things that are important. But when it came down to their A game, their entrepreneurial spirit, their ability to make money, start businesses, manage people, do leadership, and those kinds of things, drive processes that they did every single day out in the business world, there was no context for them. And I'm beginning to connect the dots. What do we need in our missional context? We need the ability to drive processes and change systems and think in terms of how do we create businesses and entrepreneurs and things like that. And my mind began to expand a little bit and realize, what if pastors like myself, instead of trying to control it and define the whole what if we began to create the space for marketplace people to come into and do their A game and let them do their A game? Well, and we're going to talk about this in our final session today. I guarantee you the first thing that happened is it scared me to death because marketplace people scare me to death. You're not huggy, feely, and touchy, and it's been interesting in the last 10 years as I've done more and more with Significant Matters, I realize that deep down inside I'm wired more like a business person. I'm losing the touch, Gary, to just huggy, feely, and I'm overstating right now. But I totally remember those days of just sitting in the restaurant and talking with people about relationships and about feelings and about things that are going on, because that's what needed to happen. That's what they look at pastors for and that ability. But I didn't know anything about a business plan. I didn't know anything about how to help a person get the kind of capital they need or even how to tell whether an idea would be a good idea or a bad. I didn't know any of that kind of stuff. But I found more and more people within my church that would be willing to do that if we would create the space for them. And one of the things I'm most grateful for that's happening in the church today, and we're going to hear from one of our speakers about that, is this concept of business as mission. And so the space is growing within our church culture to do things such as business as mission. And the church is getting to the point, pastors, of the realization that for that area to flourish, we have got to create the space for it and then step back and let our marketplace people do what they do. And yeah, it's gonna look a little different than a church board meeting or some of the other things that happen in the context of the church. But guess what? Those men and those women, out of a faith motive, out of the things that you've been teaching them through your messages and sermons, the character that's in them is dying to get out in the skills that God has given them. And so my belief is that one of the things that's happening right now is that in the church that we are mobilizing marketplace people to do the work of mission in ways that we have never seen in the history, not in recent history of the church. I think the second thing that's happened right now is that the church is beginning to understand that we need to facilitate structured and strategic collaboration. And I'm going to get to expand on that a little bit more in a session that I'm going to do, but we're beginning to realize that without structure and strategy, what we do are random acts of kindness. And the church has been great at random acts of kindness, but guess what? Random acts of kindness do not get to the systemic, sustainable changes that need to happen. We've got to figure out ways to structure and strategize together. And then finally, what I'm seeing is that we have to engage the culture. The church has lived on an island long enough, yelling at the world about all the things they're doing wrong and how they need to be differently and what we stand against as opposed to what we might stand for. Folks, there are people, there are tables within our community. We know what we're talking about there. There are groups of people, there are influencers in our communities and in communities and countries all around the world in which power structures exist, in which decisions are made, and those kinds of things. And I am amazed at how absent the church is from some of those key tables around the world. And to illustrate that, a number of years ago, Grady and I were working on some stuff around metrics and that kind of stuff. Ran into a group that came out of the Rockefeller Foundation that were in the process of of developing a taxonomy for something called the Global Impact Investment Network, GIIN. And we were wrestling with the evidence-based approach to what we're going to be doing as well, because that's all part of this whole sustainability idea. And so I just decided to reach out to the folks there, and they were working with the folks of the Acumen Fund, and these are things that if you're gonna live in this world, these are people that you need to understand who they are and what they're doing in this space, because it's very much what we're trying to talk about here, or what we're trying to be involved in. And so we just simply reached out to them and said, hey, they're creating this taxonomy so that people who want to invest in the context of poverty will have the same nomenclature that they can talk from, so they can start to collect big data so they can begin to drive decisions that way. So if I'm calling it a cow and you're calling it livestock, how can we compare and learn from that whole thing? So they're developing this taxonomy called for the Global Impact Investment Network. And it dawned on me, if you're at that table and you get to help define the conversation and the answer to that conversation, then you are in a position to be the answer to some of the questions that are being asked. But if you're not at the table, you're not even considered to be a part of the answer to the questions. You don't get to help shape those questions. And so I asked this lady as I was talking to her, are there any groups from the faith-based world that are working with you on this? And she goes, no. And then we asked her, would you be interested in somebody from the faith-based world? And she goes, absolutely. So I'm sitting here thinking, we've got some mega churches around the United States, and not one of those mega churches is involved in this. Mega churches filled with bright people like right here today, who understand the value of a shared language, who understand the value of an evidence-based approach, and there wasn't a single one. And so I had been invited to come up and speak to a group of large church mission pastors up in the Chicago area, hosted by that little church up there. And so it's a group of mission pastors that kind of meet off the grid, if you will. The one thing they all have in common are they're these mega churches. And you know, we've got this little Methodist church just down the street here that was a part of that group as well, and they had invited me to come. And part of the reason I was coming was to talk to them about this particular thing right there. And so we actually Skyped her in from the Rockefeller Foundation to talk to us about what they were doing in developing this taxonomy for Global Impact Investment Network. And my hope was that out of this group of large mission pastors from the large mission churches, all of which you would recognize around the United States, that there would be this great enthusiasm for, yes, let's get a seat at this table. Let's be a part of this whole process so that we're in that space that we want to be down the road. As these things begin to coalesce, we can help shape the questions and we can be the answer to the question that folks are asking. And after like an hour or so of Skyping back and forth, in that group, there was only one church. There was only one church that had much interest in going down that road. And that's the church that's going to be speaking here. Now, I'm not speaking poorly of the others. I want to point out the tension that the church lives under, and it's why some that I respect very much say the church is going to be of limited success in this area. And that is because the church is dealing with how it can keep doing what it's already doing in its current partnerships well. And to add on to that, these kinds of things about getting at the table where these conversations are being shaped and where the answers are being shaped is really difficult stuff for us to do. One of the reasons that I'm excited that Church of the Resurrection is going to be here today is because here is a mega church that, quite frankly, does not need to cooperate with anybody. Nobody. They're big enough, and as a matter of fact, the more they cooperate with other smaller churches, and in this city, everything is a smaller church. The more they cooperate with a smaller church, the more it slows them down. The more they cooperate with more than one, slows them down even further. And yet, what I've seen in that church that I haven't seen in a lot of other churches is that they understand that at the end, structure and strategy of working together with some others can indeed accelerate sooner or later what we're going to be able to do in the larger context. And so I'm glad for you to be able to hear Casey Stapp later on share some of the stuff that they're doing over there. So the things that I've been seeing that's going on that I think really creates for the church some amazing opportunities is that we're mobilizing marketplace people to do what they do in their A game. We're beginning to understand that structured and strategic collaboration is the way that we need to go. And I believe that finding a way to get a seat at the table and not coming with the answers, but simply coming to discover in the process. And then in the end, what I think will happen is that if we will position ourselves in places like that, we will find ourselves given the opportunity to be a part of the solutions that the world's looking for, and the kinds of sharing of the hope that we have happens in a natural way. We get to be the people that we are and talk about the things that are important to us as we go about our everyday work and working with people across this whole spectrum. One of the dangers is that this simply becomes a bandwagon, that we start using the language, but in fact all we've done is dress up relief and betterment in new language. We'll have to deal with the tension of marketing our own results in order to keep the funding coming. One of the things I've said to each of the speakers is, look, don't sell what you're doing. Tell them what you're doing. There will be no funders here. Tell what's working, tell what's not working. This is a peer-to-peer learning community. Can we accelerate our learning by being honest with what's going on? Can we figure out where the undiscovered synergies are? And can we get ourselves to a place where we would be welcome at some of these seats that I'm talking about, at the Gates Foundation, at the Rockefeller Foundation, Acumen Fund, and other places out there that I have found so far would absolutely love to have us in structured and strategic ways with the right people at the table. So you're going to get to hear from Heart to Heart International. You'll hear from Sinapi Foundation, Zoe Orphan Empowerment, Church of the Resurrection, a local effort called the Co-op, and you'll hear from somebody sharing about business's mission. It's all about the big idea. It's a long statement. Some of the folks on the leadership team encouraged me to shorten it and turn it into a statement. But I said, no, we can't turn it into a statement yet. It has to be a question, because the church is guilty, more often than not, of saying, I've got the answer, what's the question? And we can't do that here. We don't have the answer. It has to begin with a question. And so the big idea that's driving this SAT Talk and future SAT Talks is simply this: how can churches and other faith-based organizations pursue their missional goals in ways that lead to self-sustaining solutions where needs are being met without relying on charitable resources, and where the person or community has the ability to provide the ongoing means and opportunities to achieve their full potential? I've broken all the rules of a short and sweet and concise kind of a mission statement. But my hope is that you'll chew on that statement. That statement grew out of some excruciating meetings over a long period of time of trying to really define what it is that we're wrestling with. And I believe that if we stay with that question long enough, picking it apart piece by piece over time, we will begin to discover some of the answers. But if we jump to the answers before we rightly wrestle with the questions, folks, we will not be the answer to the real questions the world is crying out for today. So my greatest hope and my belief is that the church has a seat at this table, that we can be a part of the discovery process of what it looks like to create self-sustaining solutions for folks struggling in the context of poverty. And the church, as the largest philanthropic organization in the world, the largest mobilizer of people, the largest giver of money, and the greatest staying power of any organization, with the greatest delivery system of any organization. Every one of those statements is completely true. If we can figure out how to do development the way that we've done relief and betterment, folks, the church is the hope for the world, not just in the hereafter, but in the here and now. Thank you very much.